So for this project, you're going to be creating a still life composition. And so for this, I want to talk a little bit about what makes up a good composition. Now there's a lot of rules and regulations that you can learn for making good photographs or making good graphic design layouts or even making good paintings. What I'm going to be covering is just the basics, things that you should keep in mind whenever you start putting objects together and making artwork out of them. So here we go. The first thing to consider is the size and ratio of your canvas. Of course, by size, I simply mean what's the height and the width of the area you're working on. If it's taller than it is wide, this is simply called a portrait style canvas. Portrait because most portraits are done vertically like this. However, if you're doing a landscape or something that's outdoors or even a still life, the horizontal layout tends to work really well. This is because we see the world in a horizontal scale. Our eyes shift left to right more than they do up and down. What I mean by ratio is what's the relationship to the height and the width of your document. Right now, if I was to scale this down, you can see I've got a very skinny, long horizontal landscape layout. The relationship would be how tall is it versus how wide is it, and usually you measure one with the other. So if this is 1 length tall, I can say it's also 1, 2, 3 lengths wide, so it's got a ratio of 1/3. And this would change depending on how tall or skinny you would want it to be. Some ratios of canvases are more common than others. However, once I've got the size and ratio set up, now I can start talking about placing things onto my document. So when we talk about placement, what we're doing is we're talking about how do we place objects onto our canvas and what's their relationship to the edges of the canvas we're working on. Now, one of the easiest things you can do is simply place your things in the center of your canvas. There's nothing wrong with that. It's well balanced, and if I needed to, I can scale things up or scale them down, and it still looks and fits really well inside the area that I'm working on. However, a center placement of your objects tends to be the most boring placement that you can do. So let's try to create something that's a little bit more dynamic. Instead of having things in dead center, if we divide our canvas into thirds, say right here, left and right, or top to the bottom, we can place our objects on those third lines or tangent to those third lines. By moving things down or up or left or right, this creates a little bit more dynamic open space to work right here. Our eyes are shifted off to the side. Our eyes are shifted down or maybe even shifted up to a specific area. This also opens up the canvas to give you the ability to do more with it. So placing things on the what's called the rule of thirds, left and right, top to bottom, tends to be a much better looking type of arrangement. However, once we start placing things that are off to the side, it creates a little bit of an unbalance. What am I going to put in these empty areas? So the next thing we need to consider is what's the balance of your composition? Balance is exactly like it sounds. If I place an object on one side of my canvas, then I need to place another object on the other side to make it even. Try to think of your canvas as having a little scales at the very bottom. You don't want those scales to tip one way or the other. You want it to stay nice and level. However, it's not very common that you're going to paint the same thing on both sides of your canvas. Instead, you're probably going to have different sized objects, and once they become different sized, well, they're also going to have different weights. The small bowl is less visually weighty than the larger pot. So what I need to do is maybe have more bowls to work with. Having these more bowls, even smaller bowls, will allow me to have more weight on this side. Or I can start adding a variety of different size and shapes to there. If you find that you've got too much on one side, keep working with it and balance it out again on the other side. Now, of course, you don't have to have things just on one side or the other. I can bring these a little bit closer together, but all of this works out to have a nice, well-rounded and well-balanced composition. Speaking of variety of things, variety is the next thing we need to cover. They say variety is the spice of life, and it's true. You never want to have the same thing over and over again. If I was to paint this bowl multiple times on my canvas, A composition like this looks very boring. It's got the same visual weight, may have the same colors. It certainly doesn't give my eyes anything interesting to look at. So whenever you're choosing things for your composition, make sure you choose things that have a variety of sizes, things that are tall, things that are short, things that are wide. You can even have a variety of colors, a variety of tones, or even a variety of materials. So try to pick things that are very, very shiny, like metals and plastics, and maybe have some dull objects in there as well. Picking out a good variety will give your eyes something interesting and make your composition much more interesting to look at. From here, once we've got our objects, once we understand the placement and the balance, let's talk about how to enhance that balance by overlapping your objects. Overlapping solves a problem that many amateur or first-time artists tend to run into. Whenever they make a composition, they tend to place things side by side and not have them touch. The problem with this kind of composition is that it tends to look very, very flat. In the real world, things overlap, and so if you make things overlap in your composition, they look a lot more dynamic. Also, when you overlap, it forces your eye to look at the combined outline or the silhouette of all of your objects, and you can play around with how that silhouette looks, what looks better for one placement or the other. The next thing we need to consider is the lighting of your composition. Now, we've already talked about lighting before. Good lighting shows highlights, midtones, and shadows of whatever object that you're painting. So whenever you set up your light, you want to make sure that it's casting good shadows and casting good highlights on your entire composition. You never want to put a light too directly in front of your composition. That's because everything will be in nice bright highlights. Contrasting to that, you never want to put a light directly behind your objects because everything would be in shade. Good lighting pays attention to how the shadows form across your objects. They also pay attention to how the shadows form on the area that they're sitting on. And also, do they have good cast shadows on other objects? Additionally, pay attention to your highlights. Do you have a nice good highlighted areas in different places? Do I have reflected light coming off the surface that I'm working on? Setting up your lights can be a nice fun challenge to your composition. Instead of just using one spotlight, what would it look like if you used two? How would the shadows change up? Once we've got our lighting finished, now we need to talk about what does the contrast and values look on your composition. Value tells us how light and dark an area is. If I was to cover my canvas in one solid value, everything looks nice and flat. Let me grab my fill bucket tool and let's see what it looks like when I start to pop these things out in different values. So if I was to assign one object a lighter gray and maybe another object a darker gray, let's get a little bit darker with that one. And maybe another object that gray like that. Now because they have different values, they look like they're on different planes. They're being pushed away from the background. However, darker values tend to recede away while lighter values tend to come forth. So if I've got an object that's in the front that's very dark, it's going to be a little bit visually confusing. In general, you'll want to keep those darker objects towards the back. Also, if I've got two objects that are the same value side by side, it tends to make it a little bit difficult to tell which one's in front and which one's behind. So if you're going to give good contrasting values, make them very, very contrasting. So let's start changing this up and seeing how things work. If I made the front thing the lightest, that looks really, really good. If as I move backwards, we're going to get a little bit darker. Let's see, maybe that one needs to be that dark. And the final thing that's in the back will be much, much darker. Of course, I don't have to stick with my background being a middle tone of gray. If I made that very, very dark, everything really does pop out much more right now. Playing around with the contrast and values, playing around with your lights and darks is another thing that you can do when you set up your lighting of your objects. As soon as you've got a good contrast in the edges, now we need to talk a little bit about what it means to have good color in your composition. Color tends to be another area that a lot of amateurs have difficulty with. They tend to start off drawing things exactly the way they see them. So oranges or peaches tend to stay one color. Pears will stay green. Lemons will stay yellow. But as an artist, you can play around with your colors. What would this composition look like if I only painted it in one color scheme and only used tints and shades of that one color? What would it look like if I had two colors? In this case, I'm using the complementary of red and green. I can go even further and see what it would look like if it was just using warm colors. The truth is, when you limit your color palette to just a few select colors, it adds more cohesion to your entire composition. The final thing I want to share with you is, how do you challenge yourself to keep making good compositions? If you find yourself getting bored or don't know what to do with your composition, simply look at what the masters do for each of the areas we've talked about. I like to do a simple Google search for still life paintings and try to pull inspiration from them. If I looked at this one, check out all the different colors that they have and also how they're treating the shadows on this composition. Hey, look at the variety of different sized objects and how they treat the small objects and the big objects. I can even pay attention to the backgrounds and how this is very, very dark and how the lights pull out of this particular composition. Finding and seeing all of these gives me great inspiration. I can see how textures interact with each other. I can see how the artist deals with small details, or maybe if they can do a composition just using one or two brush strokes. All of these are great inspirational ideas that help me work through my own personal artwork and my own personal compositions.